Welcome to our webinar today. My name is Jeanette Stanziano, and I am happy to welcome you to How to Open a Shelter, Conduct Operations, and Avoid Mistakes. Before we begin, I would like to make a couple of housekeeping announcements. We will be recording this program, as we do with all of NYSAC webinars. And during the program, we want to encourage you to please feel free to submit any questions you have for our presenters by referring to your dashboard. Please click on the questions tab, and we ask you to type in your questions and submit them through the dashboard in writing. At the end of the presentations today, our Executive Director, Stephen Aquario, will come back on and moderate a brief Q&A at the end of the program. I would also like to tell you that the recording and a PDF of all slides from this program will be posted on the NYSAC website under archived webinars following the program today. You can also find the recording of this webinar on our YouTube channel called NYSAC TV. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce NYSAC Executive Director, Stephen J. Aquario.
Thank you, Jeanette. And thank you to our county officials who are joining us here today from all across the state of New York, including the city of New York, and to our friends on the West Coast as well who are joining us. Today's session is not about migrants, political asylum seekers. It is about a shelter operation and how to conduct shelter operations, how to open a shelter, conduct operations, and more importantly, how to avoid mistakes. Again, this is not a webinar on specifically sheltering political asylum seekers or migrants per se. Again, my name is Stephen Aquario. I'm the director of the New York Association of Counties, and I want to thank you for joining us this afternoon for a very special webinar that we're very proud to offer in partnership with IEM. IEM, and whose CEO is a friend of mine, Madhu Beriwal, is a global leader in disaster preparedness, response, and recovery. IEM works closely with government agencies, private sector organizations around the world and around the country to improve disaster preparedness, response, mitigation, and long-term recovery. And today we're going to hear how IEM can help you respond to a crisis in your county more effectively and provide essential support services to your homelessness population and other residents in times of need. We're happy to see the strong interest that we've received in this webinar from counties in New York and around the country. I want to be clear again, we're not here to talk about immigration policy or delve into any of the political connections of the current migrant crisis. Again, our goal here today is to equip you with the tools necessary to best navigate your current complex homelessness challenges you face as county leaders. The emergency response and preparedness strategies we'll hear about today are broadly applicable. Some of you have been tasked with providing shelter and other social services to migrants, such as Westchester, Albany, Monroe, and Erie counties, and others are experiencing homelessness, especially when Code Blue is in effect, and we're bracing for that this weekend. Or for current refugee resettlements from Afghanistan or Ukraine, such as what's taking place in Onondaga or Oneida counties, or from other countries. Refugee resettlements are very much part of New York State's history. Whether your next challenge is a natural disaster, a public health emergency, a public health safety, or a public safety threat, we hope that this webinar will help better empower you to respond more effectively. Joining us today, we have three of IEM's sheltering and operations experts. We're going to lead with Don Griffith, the Director of Response Operations. Don will talk about shelter considerations and contracting vehicles. Kirsten Rashko will talk about how to select shelter sites and avoid mistakes. And wrapping today's session up will be Rachel Langlis. She will be talking about lessons learned and best practices. So without further ado, I will be taking questions and answers after each individual presentation, which will run about 10 to 15 minutes per session. So we'll take questions, Jeanette, after each session. Again, if you could type those questions into your chat, into the chat box on your screen, we will answer them as we go through each session. Let's go to Don Griffith, the Director of Response Operations for IEM. Don.
Great, thank you, Stephen. I certainly appreciate the opportunity today to present before New York and our West Coast counties as well. Go to hit the slide there. Okay, today I'll give a brief introduction on Innovative Emergency Management, IEM, briefly about what the company is, what services we offer, then really start talking in the meat of sheltering, the contracts, the pricing aspects, and just some things that we can do for you and that other companies can as well. Slide. Okay, today, again, I'll go over IEM, why use contractors, solicited versus unsolicited proposals, cost assessments, pricing considerations, contracting considerations, then do a brief summary of what we just discussed. Slide. Okay, so IEM is the world's largest woman-owned firm that specializes in emergency management. We've been in business for 38 years now. We're also a certified woman-owned business in the state of New York as well. Over the past years, for 38 years, we've done over $250 billion in grant federal funding, managed over 1,000 projects. During COVID, we did over 380 billion AI simulations for COVID. That was given pro bono to all the counties throughout the United States. We have customers from all levels of government, to include the federal government, state, local. We've done work in all 50 of the United States, and we're actually up to 5 territories now as of last month. We also do international work. Again, we've been in business 38 years. We have 1,200 employees and about a little more than $1 billion over the past 5 years revenue-wise. Slide. This is just a little snapshot of what IEM as a customer base looks like. Obviously, we're emergency management firm, so FEMA is typically our #1 customer. Most of our contracts we have that are funded by, that supporting the state and locals are actually through federal grant money. But we've done over 40 federal agencies, all 50 United States, multiple cities, including all the big cities. We've done counties. We have transit partners. We've done private sector work. So we really are, one stop. We work with everybody. Slide. Okay, this kind of just highlights we are an emergency management firm. We do all phases of emergency management. We also do provide digital services, digital support for victims. About 1/3 of the company actually focuses on IT. About 1/3 is Homeland Security. And the other 1/3 is typically Department of Defense type stuff. But we are everywhere. During COVID, we did stand up what's called IEM Health, which is IEM's health directorate. And that was very big for us during COVID, where we had the opportunity to go to do monoclonal antibody treatments, vaccinations, set up alternate care sites. We did this at the state, local level throughout the United States. We also did this with a federal FEMA contract where we did staff augmentation, and we're actually the ones administering the shots for a lot of the Walgreens and CVS pharmacy and so forth. Anything that was getting FEMA funding. Slide. Right, so obviously we're talking about sheltering. Sheltering really doesn't just mean homelessness. It can mean homelessness. It could be migrants, could be asylum seekers, could be victims from natural disasters, could be something as simple as your house burned down and you have the Red Cross is providing you sheltering. We can maybe put you up in the hotel until you can get a more permanent place to live. IEM does all aspects of emergency management. We also respond to disasters. We do preparedness, response, recovery, mitigation. My expertise is response. We do a lot of the responses for FEMA under our contracts. We also do some of the state and local responses. We do mass care. We'll do staff augmentation in the Emergency Operations Center. That during COVID was one of the biggest contracts we had, was going throughout the United States and providing the much needed relief to the staff that were working 24/7 during the COVID response. Slide. Okay, so homelessness challenges. Again, I want to emphasize homelessness. It could be, no kidding, just really people that are homeless. It can be migrants. It can be those that are victims of disasters. So homelessness really covers a much broader spectrum than what we may normally think of. Many jurisdictions throughout the United States are having to issue out contracts. They're doing it something as simple as getting contracts to get hotel support, to catering, to providing security, full gamut of support operations they need. There are also different types of contracts and different types of pricing methods that can either help you or hinder your response. In this budget tight world we're in, we all need to watch our funding. And the type of contract you use and the method that you're pricing it can make a huge impact on whether you spend extra millions of dollars you don't need to. Slide. Okay, so why use contractors? I'm retired military. When I was in the military, I didn't understand at the time why we needed contractors. Now on the other side, I've had a chance to see exactly why you do need contractors. Government has staff, they have other duties as well. When you're doing a response to disaster, you still have your day job and you're trying to surge to do a response. Initially, that can be done then, we can all do that. But when a disaster turns into something more long-term like COVID, where it was 3+ years, you're gonna burn out your staff. They can't handle that kind of pace indefinitely. We give the ability to do a staff augmentation. Oftentimes, the government needs a specialty that just isn't available in the normal workforce. Most emergency operations centers don't have former hotel managers that know how to do hoteling and how to manage a hotel for you, or that type of situation. We can be cheaper. Contractors have to be cost efficient for our own purposes. Hey, we want to make a better profit, so that's advantageous for us to be efficient on our pricing. But it also we need to pass that savings on to you because we need to be competitive against each other. So there's a lot of reasons why a contract can be a lot cheaper. Plus, you're only paying for what you need. If you don't need certain services, you're not paying for those services, whereas the government may have to normally retain everything. So there are some advantages and give you some certain amount of efficiencies as well. Slide. All right, so get into the contracting side of the house. Before you get to the contracting, you're going to go through a proposal process. Many jurisdictions are issuing out a request for proposal, RFP. That's going to be your solicited one. Many jurisdictions get unsolicited proposals from contractors like myself. Why? If we see in the news that your state has a need and we don't have a contract with you, we'll reach out to you and just see, is there some support we can lend to you? If there is, fantastic, we want to help you. If there is not, and you have everything you need, that's fine too. We certainly want to make sure we don't give you more than what you need. But you will get unsolicited proposals from contractors. You still have to follow the standard procurement process. So even if you get an unsolicited proposal, you're still, and you want to get that contractor hired up, there's still processes you have to follow for procurement. Unsolicited proposals can give you some ideas how to technical approach how to solve a problem. Industry is very resourceful, thinks outside the box and thinks about being very efficient and cost effective. So we can potentially give you a solution you may not have thought about. This is also a great source for cost estimate for you as well. I know a lot of project officers struggle with, I want to issue out an RFP. I don't have a clue what my budget's going to be, how much it's going to cost. Oftentimes I'll get calls, in this case, unsolicited calls from potential clients that just want a cost estimate. They need help. How much is this going to cost? And they'll call me up or they'll call up some other companies and just get a variety of cost estimates to figure out what this is going to cost before they put out their RFP. Slide. So pricing considerations. Typically, there are 3 main pricing models that you're going to see, types of contracts. You're going to see a firm fixed price contract, time materials, and cost plus. Firm fixed price contracts sound like it sounds. You're hiring me for a project, and you say you want me to paint a room for you. I'm going to tell you I'm going to charge you $500 per room. Whether that costs me $500 more or less, it's on the contract at that point. You're not going to pay any different. It's going to be exactly that price. For a known project that doesn't have a great deal of risk, that's pretty good for a contractor to do it for a while. They can figure out exactly what it's going to cost, and they can really, it's not as much risk to them if it's a known entity. A lot of the sheltering work we do, there's a lot of variation there. There's a lot of risk. And so you're going to find contractors typically aren't going to want to do that. Time and materials is what you're typically going to find the contracts being set up as. So if you get an hour work out of a contractor, he's going to charge you for an hour's work. If he has to buy a paint bucket, he's going to charge you for that paint bucket. So that's just a pure time materials. Again, those are the most common ones. Then there's cost plus, and that one, I'm not a big fan of cost plus. Cost plus is my actual cost plus a percentage profit. The problem is that we really, in our company, like to make sure the client is extremely happy. We're willing to take money out of our own pocket to make sure that happens. If it's a cost plus, that really, no kidding, comes out of my pocket, versus I have a little bit of room on a time materials contract when I do my pricing, that if I need to spend a little extra money, I can still do that and make my requirements. So we generally try to stick mainly with the time materials. Then you've got different types of rates structure, and the rates we find really makes a huge difference. What you're going to see is that for straight time and overtime rates, just like you say, if you're working 40 hours a week, we're going to charge you a straight time, what it's going to cost an hourly rate. If that employee, on a lot of the sheltering contracts, employees who work in 10 to 12 hours a day and maybe working 60, 70 hours a week, there's also mean overtime. And when we do straight time and overtime rates, the jurisdiction is going to play those exact rates. The alternative is to do a blended rate. A blended rate will be that I'll figure out what I think the hourly cost of that employee in straight time and overtime, what that's going to be, and I'll pass that to you. The advantage to the government for the blended rate is that if the overtime goes up, goes down, it's a set rate. It makes invoicing, approving invoices a lot easier for you. It's a simpler process. The disadvantage for the government, and why I would really prefer most time stick with straight time and overtime rates to the government, is if you need to cut your cost, you can do that if you increase the number of employees, reduce or eliminate the overtime altogether, and you're going to see immediate savings. If you try that same approach using a blended rate, the contractor will make more profit. If you reduce or eliminate overtime, my profit goes up, but it's absolutely no additional savings to the government at all. So outside the ease of invoicing for the government to review invoices, I really encourage most clients to stick with the straight time and overtime rates. That way you can realistically not lose money. And if you need to adjust the pricing structure to eliminate overtime to make your dollars last longer, you have that ability to do that. Then you have reimbursable travel versus inclusive travel rates. I would prefer to do travel straight reimbursable, but typically what we see is that we'll add what we anticipate the rate for travel into our hourly rates. So that's something we'll do. It's something that's completely negotiable with the client. I generally prefer having straight reimbursable. It's the most savings to the customer that way. But again, for ease of invoicing, most customers seem to prefer the inclusive rates for travel. We already discussed overtime versus no overtime. If you do no overtime, you're going to save money. The problem you're going to find is a lot of the workers count on that overtime. And so if they're deploying, they want to have that overtime. They don't want to work 40 hours a week. They want to work a lot more than that. So that can come and be a problem down the road. All right, then the last one I want to really cover here is staffing numbers versus positions. You really, at that point, you want to staff the positions. Don't tell the contractor how many employees you put on the project. Tell them how many staffing positions you want filled, and let them worry about the math behind it. Slide. Okay, and contract considerations here. We saw a lot in 2022 with this sheltering when it really picked up. Was a lot of emergency contracts. So you've never done this before. It's a real emergency, and you can bypass a lot of the procurement processes for that. At some point, the emergency kind of goes away, and you really need new standard contracting methods. Sole sources of the sheltering program really is kind of hard to justify typically. If it's something very unique to that company that nobody else does it, it's a lot easier to explain. Sheltering, it's a lot of companies do it. Single award contract is just that. You award one contract to one company. That's, I guarantee you most companies prefer that. Multiple award contract, it gives you some flexibility. You have a approved vendor pool, and you put out the requirements for the task orders and everybody bid on them. That is more cumbersome and takes longer. Then there's also what's a standby contract. And the standby contracts is just that. You have a contract issued out. If you don't need it, you don't use it. It doesn't cost you any money to have that contract just sitting on the shelf waiting to be out there. But if you need it, you can activate it immediately. So it's a very fast method. Slide. Okay, and just a brief summary. I want to save my time here. Briefly discuss the contract tools available to you. Solicited versus unsolicited proposals, cost estimates, price considerations, and some contracting considerations. This is all very high level talk, but hopefully you guys have some questions, and certainly willing to have our contact information. You reach out to us afterwards, and more willing to have more conversation, follow up on it any time. Slide. All right, and that completes my presentation. I appreciate everybody's time, and Kirsten will be following me up. Thank you.
Okay, let's see if we have any questions before we go to Kirsten here. Let me check the question queue. If you have questions, now would be the time to submit them to Don or to me here, and I can answer them, or we can, of course, wait until the end and pick them up then. But let's see, I have one in here now about, can you explain again this sort of a pre-planning procurement vehicle here in a non-emergency situation? You mentioned several. The question is concerning the standby contract. Can you go over the benefits and the procedures used to select a standby contract, Don?
Absolutely. Yes, the standby contract, the procurement process for that is identical to the other contracts typically. You issue out an RFP, you get companies to bid on it. You can either do a single award or a multiple award. And it's just a contract. Let's give an example, disaster housing. You have a contract issued out that you're going to already select vendors to provide that support for you. You've had rates already negotiated, statement of work, the general terms have already been predetermined. And you'll typically at that point issue out the task order for any specific for that disaster. The advantage to you is the procurement process at that point has already been done. You can have that contract sit on the shelf 3, 4, 5 years, a valid contract. You don't have to do anything with it. Doesn't cost you any money to have that contract there. But say Superstorm Sandy came, you had flooding, you need to do a response for that one. You can then activate that contract. All the rates are negotiated. You just have to issue them out a notice to proceed, tell them what you want to be done, typically again through a task order issuance. I typically, at the beginning, when I became a contractor 15 years ago, I didn't really understand or appreciate the advantages of that type of contract. My take is I bid on it, and I may get work and may not get work. These are important contracts, and if you're in a jurisdiction that has a certain threat that comes up periodically, and you know you're going to need that support, you're better off just getting the standby contract out there. And your contractors will appreciate it, because down the road, when you need it, it'll be a very fast process to activate it.
Okay, in the interest of time, we will now move to Kirsten Rushko, Program Manager, and Kirsten is going to talk about how to select shelter sites and, more importantly, how to avoid costly mistakes. Kirsten.
Hello and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kirsten Roshko, and I am the Humanitarian Response Operations Program Manager with Innovative Emergency Management, or IEM. My previous work experience includes most recently being an incident commander on behalf of the California Department of Social Services Migrant Sheltering Operation. I hold a Master's in Science in Humanitarian Emergencies and International Development from the London School of Economics, and I am a subject matter expert on human trafficking, case management, mass care and sheltering, and migration, including refugee and asylum seekers. It is a pleasure to be presenting with you all today. During my component of the presentation, I will be discussing considerations when selecting a sheltering site, which will lead to avoiding mistakes or acknowledging challenges prior to standing up operations. Don did a fantastic job of highlighting all of the different work IEM completes. In addition to what Dawn shared, we have completed emergency response planning and preparedness projects in all 50 United States and 5 U.S. territories, serving a variety of federal, local, and state governments, including New York City and New York State. Regarding mass care and sheltering, we have worked on operations in several locations, including but not limited to New York, Washington, D.C., Chicago, California, and Colorado. Our projects include rapid deployment of experienced staff who are prepared to hit the ground running, and we have experience providing teams in 24 to 96 hours of the requested time for staff. Next slide, please. IEM works alongside our clients, including government agencies, to ensure key goals of sheltering operations are met. As Dawn also noted, IEM can and has provided all types of services for shelters, including holistic medical services, basic needs such as meals, clothing, hygiene items, wraparound shelter services, and other provisions such as janitorial staff, security, shelter workers, and management, and any other unique needs as requested by the client. IEM is also pleased to offer several subject matter experts to assist our clients with both the development and onset of new projects, as well as long-term forecasting and planning. Next slide, please. When opening a shelter for any population, including disaster survivors, people experiencing homelessness, or migrants, there are some very typical elements to consider when selecting a site. I would first like to acknowledge the fact that it can be difficult to identify a site in general, especially a congregate facility, which will have minimal impact on the community. That being said, there are certainly specifications our team looks for when identifying a shelter location. This includes ensuring a potential shelter site can meet the designated needs for sleeping requirements, such as appropriately separating sleeping areas. Sleeping areas are generally split by creating separate spaces for men, women, and families. Upon visiting a potential shelter site to see if it is a good fit, analyzing how a space can meet these needs for the shelter population is essential. For example, if a shelter is meant to only serve single men, the need can look very different than if it is a multi-gender or family site. When we are not afforded the opportunity to choose a site, but rather when an agency must work with the site they were assigned to, documenting and weighing risk factors of that site is critically important to ensure full transparency prior to the onset of an operation. This means essentially providing an analysis of any gaps that the facility may have and raising that to leadership for consideration. Additionally, sleeping areas can look very different depending on the space available. A congregate area, for example, may require the installation of partitions. Alternatively, a hotel made into a shelter may have other considerations, such as who will share a hotel room. There are pros and cons to both sheltering options, and there are definitely analytics that need to be performed to ensure that the site is operating at its full functionality. Another consideration when selecting a site is to map out the designated eating and recreation areas. Ensuring that these areas are accounted for, as well as the limiting factors, will also help identify potential barriers and risks. Depending on the shelter and the circumstances, it may not be possible for guests to enter and exit the facility. For example, if there is an active natural disaster, or if policies in place prohibit in and out access, guests may not be able to leave that facility. As such, it can be very beneficial to map out potential recreational areas and activities to ensure shelter guests are occupied. This is even more crucial when serving families that have small children, as activities for small children are essential to ensure their well-being. And certainly, shelter services must be available for those with access and functional needs. This includes entrances and exits, beds or cots, bathrooms, and access to services for those who have access and functional needs, including those who are deaf and hard of hearing, and other services to ensure everyone can gain access to the sheltering in times of need. This in and of itself can be its own training, but hopefully adding this consideration will help you in your shelter planning. Next slide. The location of a shelter, ideally in a neighborhood that is supportive of the population being served, is ideal. Safety concerns and political challenges may exist in certain jurisdictions, making it difficult or even impossible to rent a facility in certain locations. It's really critical and important when one is looking for a sheltering location to understand the local politics and the local population and ensure that there's a heavy understanding of what opening a shelter for whatever population you are serving is understood. Another component to consider is language access. This is especially important when serving migrants, but it's also important when serving the general U.S. population. As some reports claim, more than 20% of U.S. citizens speak a language other than English at home. Having bilingual staff that represent the guest population, as well as signs in English and various other languages, can be incredibly beneficial for both shelter guests who are literate, as well as staff, as it will reduce the instances where guests ask for directions at a shelter or need assistance in identifying where they need to go. Additionally, providing policies or protocols to guests in their language of literacy can be incredibly beneficial in order to provide information without repeating it, as well as to enforce rules and regulations at a shelter. Of course, again, this is most relevant for individuals who are literate, and there may be individuals, both U.S. citizens, migrants, disaster survivors, and the homeless who may not be literate, so other considerations should be made for those individuals. Although this next item may not always be possible, private spaces can be incredibly beneficial in a shelter situation. Giving shelter guests the ability to meet with resource navigators, caseworkers, attorneys, and other individuals at a location where they shelter removes the potential barrier of transportation, which will essentially assist with long-term self-sufficiency. Privacy is beneficial, as sometimes it is critical for guests to share private information with their caseworkers or attorney, and they may not feel comfortable doing so in a public setting. As much as it's possible, it's very much so recommended to have a private space for these meetings to help ensure that those recovering from a disaster, experiencing homelessness, or other situations can have an adequate space that prevents any barriers from their self-sufficiency. Next slide, please. Additional services to consider when providing for this population and selecting sites are answering questions when looking at sites such as, does this location have a kitchen, or would it be more effective and efficient to utilize an outside meal vendor? Similarly, accounting for dietary restrictions in the population served, whether it be health restrictions or religious beliefs, is important to ensure both proper nutrition of those being sheltered and minimize food waste. Likewise, understanding the population that will be served as much as possible will help with targeting donation needs, such as clothing, hygiene products, and other specialized items. For example, at a family sheltering site, baby formula may be essential, where for a site with single males, this would not be an item that would be required. Therefore, understanding the intent behind the population served at a shelter location can help create a very defined scope of needs, including meals as well as donation and other goods for serving the population. It is also important that staff are familiar with trauma-informed services. Whether the shelter is intended for survivors of a natural disaster, those experiencing homelessness, or migrants, all individuals may have experienced trauma in their lives and may exhibit behaviors that are trauma responses, which can be easily misunderstood. Trauma-informed care could be in its own presentation, so I won't attempt to cover the important topic here, but I will say that providing staff with context and trainings will help minimize misunderstandings with shelter guests and will make for a better overall operation for guests, for staff, and for the agency overseeing the operation. Similarly, client-centered services or guest-centered services are also important considerations. Creating a shelter and hiring staff with a guest in mind from the onset of the development and selection process will create a successful operation. Also, having a team on the ground that understands shelter work is intrinsically customer service is essential. Another element to note would be travel and transportation. Coordination of travel and transportation when searching for a shelter is very important, as it is ideal to shelter guests in a location near reliable public transportation, and also, if possible, near local providers, including medical services, case management organizations, and schools, to help shelter guests in their path towards self-sufficiency or recovery. It is also beneficial to have staff that can support residents in the orientation of transportation resources. The ability to navigate public transportation can be tricky, and the ability to adequately understand and move about a city or location freely is a major step towards self-sufficiency. Therefore, being able to provide individuals, staff that can actually help navigate public transportation can really assist with shelter guest self-sufficiency. The last topic I will touch on today, in the interest of time, is understanding the resource needs that a potential shelter site may have. For example, if a facility has a fence, that may make the location secure and require less security staff. Alternatively, if a government or organization is also looking at a facility that has no fence in place, it may be advisable to either put up a temporary fence or hire additional security. Of course, at face value, it may seem that the facility that already has a fence in place is actually more expensive if the cost on the sticker price is higher. But when you add those wraparound services, fencing and security, it might actually be more advisable to go with the initially more expensive shelter, because these wraparound services might actually make it less cost effective for the clients and for those who are actually acquiring the shelter facility. Additionally, ensuring that there are other proper resources to function as shelter is really important for the health of the shelter. So one example would be looking at the entrance and exit points for each shelter. As I previously noted, security at each entry and exit is definitely recommended, but it's also important to consider log in and log out mechanisms to identify who is and who is not at the shelter for safety purposes, and also to adhere to policy and procedure. Signage at entry and exit points are also important, as well as other items such as potentially wristbands and radios, things of that nature, to ensure proper communications across the sheltering site. There are hundreds of other items to consider when standing up a shelter, and to ensure that it is effective and efficient and secure. By no means have I been able to address all of the items to consider when selecting a migrant shelter or a shelter for those experiencing homelessness or disaster survivors, but I do hope this information has assisted with the preliminary assessment and perhaps has assisted in sparking some thoughts. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Kirsten. I'm going to hold on some questions that we have in the queue and go right, in the interest of time, to Rachel Langles, and we'll hear from Rachel about lessons learned and best practices in shelter operations. Rachel.
Thank you so much, Stephen, and good afternoon, everyone. I am Rachel Langles, the Manager for Humanitarian Response Operations with IEM, and I come today with a background in contingency response planning and operations, as well as public health. Next slide, please. Here's a brief overview of the topics that I'll be covering. Starting off, next slide, please, with protocols and policies. Certainly not the most exciting topic to cover out the gate, but as Kirsten had first alluded to, this will just help make sure that your operations continue to run smoothly. It's imperative to start any sheltering operation with a solid shelter protocol and policies in place. At the outset of any new operation, these policies and procedures may, of course, require some revisions and refinement. That's normal, it's expected, but some planning ahead of time will really make a difference in how heavy of a lift it is to kick off operations. Some types of plans, protocols, and procedures that would be important to include for any type of shelter operations, given migrant shelter operations or survivors of natural disasters, might include emergency action plans. These would include evacuation plans, as well as the how, when, and who to coordinate with locally in any sort of response. Standard operating procedures, potential infection control plans, as we can all well attest to, given to having survived this most recent pandemic. As well as that, we'd want to consider de-escalation protocols and any sort of security protocols that you would need to include depending upon your guest population. Next slide, please. Another element that would be important to consider is how to manage your staff. As you may well imagine, it can be a little complicated to guarantee ample staffing throughout a very fluid and an ever-changing environment with shifting needs and requirements. Here are a few considerations that IEM has found extremely useful and valuable with staffing 24/7, 365 operations. Flexible staffing plan. What is your plan to fill any gaps due to staff calling out? Do you have additional staff available to cover for this new operational gap? Volunteer overtime opportunities. Not to say that these volunteers are unpaid, but offering to pick up extra shifts or possibly volunteering to be available to pick up mid-shift if there is an increase in an operational need. How do you plan to address operational gaps or even identify operational gaps? What is your expected or desired staff to guest ratio? How many staff can you actually be short by on any given shift and still maintain safe, fluid, and continuous operations? Have you put any thought into preparing for any surge needs? What is your staffing plan in place to address any sudden shift in throughput or any sudden need to open up an additional shelter? Are there additional victims now? What if an additional 5 buses have just shown up that you only expected to have 5 buses already show up? Now you're at 10. Do you have enough staff to be able to address for that new need? Do you have a deep enough talent pool that can be available to help address these sudden shifts? Next slide, please. As Kirsten had previously alluded to, creating some sort of safe space for guests is imperative. Whether you're sheltering individuals from a natural or man-made disaster or sheltering asylum seekers, it's expected that some of this population will be dealing with recent acute traumas. They might have lost their home. They're possibly displaced to a new country and a new culture. It's possible that they've either witnessed or experienced injuries or violence. It's possible that you might be sheltering victims of human trafficking, and you'd want to be sure that they have a safe, private, and calm location to bring these folks to in such an event. Next slide, please. Properly training staff who will be supporting and interacting with any guests or clients in a shelter will make a remarkable difference in the overall success of the mission, to include overall safety, resiliency, and support in an effective environment. You'll also note that we have a certain cadence to our training events, and intentionally have mandatory as well as optional additional training events available to the teams of staff supporting any shelter operation. I'll go through some examples on this next slide, please. Some of the training considerations that we've included for our shelter staff and shelter managers included, but are certainly not limited to the following: anti-discrimination, data security, HIPAA and PII requirements, as well as familiarization with the incident command structure that provides a common language and a common nomenclature for response operations. Providing staff with a deployment guide ahead of kicking off operations so that they can familiarize themselves with the operations, the clients that they're going to be serving, as well as the operational needs of their specific role. Certainly also want to include cultural competency awareness, awareness for identifying victims of domestic violence and human trafficking and what to do in those instances. And that ties directly into incident reporting. Making sure that all of your staff on the ground supporting these operations know how to identify an issue as well as how to escalate it appropriately. And very important, and I know that we've touched on this previously with Kirsten's presentation as well with Dawn's, is making sure that all of your staff is trained with trauma-informed care in mind. Some ongoing trainings that we always keep in the back of our minds as optional for our staff might include things like applied suicide interventions, as well as behavioral change facilitation. Next slide, please. And depending upon the size and the scope of your sheltering mission, you'll likely want to consider including some specialty roles in your requests. Some of these roles might include the following: public information officers to assist with media management, possibly designating one if not multiple safety officers to make sure that the emergency action plans that you've devised and implemented at your sites are relayed to the staff and followed through with, and also making sure that the leadership knows how to implement any sort of emergency action plan. Kirsten also talked about the need to make sure that transportation is addressed during shelter operations. Having someone be available as a point person or a liaison for transportation needs goes a really long way, as does providing some sort of resource navigator to those folks that are looking for transitioning long-term into the community. Next slide, please. As you can tell with these best practices, I've certainly touched on people and staff a whole lot. IEM's people-centered approach includes trauma-informed and survivor-centric, culturally competent solutions. And the delivery of effective services includes a supported transition and acclimation for asylum seekers or for any shelter guests. Next slide, please. I'd say that this is probably one of the most important elements, is certainly remaining flexible. IEM does have a whole host of comprehensive services, whether a la carte or wraparound services. Some of those certainly can be applicable across many operations, but not every operation might need data capture and metrics reporting. Some might absolutely need public assistance and grants management. How are you going to shift the staffing need based off of operational needs? So suffice it to say that IEM does, again, have a whole host of options as far as supporting any sort of shelter operation for any municipality. Next slide, please. Thank you so much for your time and your attention. IEM certainly remains committed to providing critical shelter solutions for asylum seekers and victims of any sort of disaster in any community. Thank you for your time.
Okay, thank you, Rachel, and thank you to Don and Kirsten. We're approaching the end here of our session. We do have a few questions in the queue. I'll start with Rachel at the end here. It's sort of a longer question here. The question concerns, I understand that a base camp or a tent city sheltering might be more affordable than non-congregate sheltering options, but these tents often cannot withstand the extreme winter weather in the Northeast. What are other options out there?
Thank you so much, Stephen, and that's a fantastic question. In fact, I see a second question buried in there. I'll do my best to address both. First and foremost, yes, we've certainly seen most municipalities moving away from hoteling as an option specific to the migrant sheltering needs and crisis that we're currently seeing. So outfitting a non-congregate shelter, which Kirsten had touched on pretty thoroughly, would certainly be a cost-saving solution potentially. That might look like setting up our operations in a convention center with pipe and drape privacy, and many options that can be built into a non-congregate setting. But in regards to your question about the tent base camp operations that we have the capacity to stand up within 1 week of notification of the need, we do actually have hard-sided tent options as well. So those are our 4-season tent options, and those actually are insulated and well heated. So that actually is an option for some of the colder climates, luckily. I hope that that really kind of helped illuminate some of the misgivings that folks might have about shelter operations, or even with regards just to tent operations. Thank you, Stephen.
Okay, Rachel, thank you. Let's go to Don. A question. I know the association, I'm saying this, the association is advocating in Congress for what's called impact aid, or aid provided to communities, whether they are school districts for educating children, or counties for any health or human services, language, or council expenses that may end up ultimately impacting counties for migrants or homelessness. The question is regarding funding. Don, in your experience, is there funding that's presently available out there for the programs and services that you've described? Where do you typically see funding coming from?
And that one I could defer to Kirsten. She's going to be a lot more knowledgeable on the EFSP program. I think they're really referring to. Kirsten?
Absolutely. Hi, folks. So FEMA does have some funding sources available. It's called the Emergency Food and Shelter Program, or EFSP, which is really meant to be for mass care and sheltering opportunities. There is a new funding source called EFSPH, or Emergency Food and Sheltering Programs Humanitarian, that has been meant specifically for more of the migrant crisis, whereas EFSP without the H was really meant to be for general mass care and sheltering. So that is a good jumping off point for mass care and sheltering funding in general when we're thinking federally. A lot of funding sources do occur though once an emergency declaration has been issued. So if it is more in the face of a natural disaster, it's probably a real-time funding source from the federal government or from local governments, even with those executive orders issued by governors or local elected officials as well. Don and Rachel, please feel free if you have any additional information you'd like to add.
I think you nailed it. Thank you, Kirsten.
Okay, so another question is, how does IEM overlap a potential county who's working with an existing hotel housing shelter needs? Are there services that IEM provides as a wraparound to existing provider services?
We can really fall into whatever's necessary. If there's already a hoteling and there's a contract set up, we can do something just as simple as provide shelter staff and the management for that. It really depends what the needs of the jurisdiction. If they need a complete wraparound service to the point that we contract directly with a hotel, or as Rachel mentioned about doing a tent or soft-sided options, we can do that as well. We can be your single source, so you shut one contract and would have all the wraparound services underneath that one contract.
Okay, another question here. What is the average time to set up a shelter, a temporary / permanent shelter service, and have it be fully functional for a homeless or migrant program?
I can tell you for the, I'll let Kirsten jump in on the hard side, but the soft side, we can generally deploy throughout the entire country, and within about 1 week time have a soft or tent shelter system set up and fully operational, up to about 1,000 people without killing additional resources. And about a week after that, we can get up to about 2 additional 1,000, and then we can keep scaling up as necessary. But it's really going to match what the client's needs are. Kirsten, you want to weigh in more on the setup of the hoteling? I think you were pretty instrumental in that one in California.
Absolutely, happy to, Don. I think it's important to note that a lot of the contracts, especially if it's government to hotel contracts, will take time depending upon the internal processes of the government as well as the hotel itself. So if we clear out the red tape piece of that, meaning going through the contractual obligation of jumping through the legal hoops and contracts team reviews, it can be quite quick to actually release a facility or to rent a facility when it's a hotel. One of the important lessons learned, I think Don, Rachel, and I have all learned from operating and working in these hotels specifically, is it's incredibly important prior to standing up an operation, do a full facilities check and note any issues with the facility, so that the renter does not assume the cost of the facility. So depending on the power of individuals, how many folks you can have on the ground to do a very good check for safety as well as for documentation of those purposes, it can take a while, but I'll say for IAM, because we do have such a good cache of individuals available and experts who've done this before, we have minimal stand-up time for operations like that.
Law enforcement is very much part of our role and responsibilities in county government through the office of the sheriff. The question here is, if needed, do you, or requested, do you provide or could you provide support for our Red Cross shelters if needed and paid for by the county?
Yeah, that's absolutely no problem. As long as we have a contract in place or a notice to proceed on that contract, we can certainly support it.
Well, how would you go about, is that sort of your vision, Don, there about a standby contract and why that works so well?
That's certainly going to be the really the fastest, the cleanest way of doing it. If you know about, every jurisdiction has some hazards they traditionally encounter. If you know there's something out there that you may want a contract for, go to get it issued out now. Whether you have a disaster or not, getting it in advance will allow that contract to be a lot more flexible for you. And again, it also locks in your rates as well for you. So that kind of gives stability to the county to know what your rate's going to be. Other thing, when you start to think about FEMA reimbursement down the road, they're going to see it's competitively bid. If you try to do a sole source emergency contract, you may have to do more justification on that one versus a regular procurement. It's a standby contract. It's going to be a lot cleaner for you.
Okay, thank you for that question, and thank you for the answer. Kirsten, in your experience, this comes up quite a bit. In your experience, in your work, have issues regarding sheltering sex offenders, criminal offenders, serious issues, criminal in nature or lack of vetting or whatnot, or even medical needs personnel. If so, how did the impact in shelter location, how did that impact shelter location selection? So I guess this question is let's just deal with sex offenders or certain individual medical needs. How did that impact shelter location selection?
Absolutely. I'll do my best to answer that question because I think there were a lot of important components.
Yeah, you might have
regarding. No worries. Happy to try to, and I hope this answers the intended question. I'll start first with just in terms of staff that are hired on. It's always advised that all staff at a facility do have an extensive background check completed. So there should be no concern for any workers on site for the shelter for that side of it to have any concerns of them with being on a sex offender registry or anything of that nature. Should anything be flagged, those individuals, in my experience, have not been hired and would not be able to proceed with their hiring process unless, of course, there are explicit considerations that might be policies advised by certain HR teams or governments that allow for certain components there. So it's really important to get from that angle to ensure the staff that are on site are really the best, highest quality people that will keep the individuals safe. Regarding individuals who are sheltered in particular, in general, shelters are safe locations where people are able to receive services holistically. And I think that's one of the really important pieces to highlight is the importance of having proper designation for certain spaces for people, as well as having proper monitoring of activities. And as Rachel mentioned too, having proper protocols and policies in place so that once individuals are entering in the shelter, immediately or shortly thereafter entering, they receive and understand the policies and protocols that they have to adhere to when they're in the shelter. And that gives everybody grounds in order to evict somebody from a shelter should they do anything that is outside of the policies and procedures of that shelter. And of course, also in pertinence to U.S. law, of course, no law can be broken within a shelter. It's not a safe haven or anything of that nature. So explicitly laying out protocols and policies but also ensuring that there's good monitoring of the spaces. So in shelters I've operated or worked with or seen before throughout my experiences, there are shelter monitors who are constantly roving, and if possible or if deemed necessary, security staff, although we do find general shelter workers to be a little bit more trauma informed and client facing, to make sure there's nothing happening that shouldn't be happening. And that is always a top of mind concern, especially when we're looking at these congregate facilities that are larger and may have multiple groups of individuals there. So I definitely appreciate the security component of that question. And if the individual who posed that question has any additional questions, or if I didn't answer the question fully, please feel free to add an additional question.
Okay, I want to thank our team from IEM, Don, Rachel, Kirsten. Thanks so much. Their contact information is on this screen here that you see at your computer. We will also post this web. We're at the top of the hour now. We'll post this on the NYSAC website at the end of the day. This webinar will be available. Thanks, folks, for joining us, and have a great week.